And we are here in the iconic Johnny's Coffee Shop at the intersection of Fairfax and Wilshire with Carl Petersen. You're not a usual school board candidate. You're not a teacher. You're a parent. Tell us why you decided to even run for this position.
I got involved about 4 years ago. Two of my daughters have special needs. So they kind of plateaued, and so we talked to their teachers because, I believe that parents and teachers need to work together. And we developed a plan, but the district wouldn't allow those items into their individual education plan. So we had to hire a lawyer and sue. So we spent 2 days downtown in a conference room, and at some point I turned to my wife and said, somebody's got to change this. And she looked at me and said, how about you? So I'm here, and so I made my first run for school board at that point. And we come from the Valley, so it was in the Valley, and we ran against a pro-charter board member also, Tamara Galatzin, and there was 5 of us who ran against her, and we forced her into a runoff. I supported the person who won, who got second place, and he won. So after, helping Scott Schmerelson win, I continued with issues, and, I was writing my blog and, stayed very involved. And then we got closer to this election, and there wasn't a lot of people stepping up to run against Monica Garcia. And I see her as the biggest threat to all the children in the district, including District 2. And so I was thinking about it and kind of filed the paperwork that you have to, to start fundraising and, but we hadn't really made the decision yet. And I sat in a board meeting and she said, I'm not about defunding special ed, but how we can take care of our kids. And at that point I said, I'm in. It's just, there's no way that I can't combat that and hold her accountable. Somebody had to oppose her, and so I did. And she's just continued with those type of quotes. At some point, she said, we spoke before about the failing school myth. She sat there on the board and just said most of our kids can't read. And I'm like, wait, you're running for a re-election. You think the kids can't read? Perhaps you should step aside. But she's just so beholden to that whole myth and creating the need for charter schools that she'll spread it.
Carl, tell us who is the Betsy DeVos in L.A.?
Eli Broad, who has devoted millions of dollars to basically trying to privatize our schools. He has a published goal of bringing 50% of our, he calls it, market share to charters. So, he is the Betsy DeVos of L.A.
And who is he? Tell us a little bit about this man.
He made his fortune in real estate. He basically he had no real estate experience, but looked at the market and said, I could do it better. And he kind of approaches education the same way. He has no experience in education, but he's decided he knows the best way to do it.
Tell us about some of his efforts with education. Specifically describe the Broad Foundation and the Broad Academy.
So the Broad Academy is his way of pushing this education theory that he has, and he trains superintendents who he then sets loose on school districts to try to basically push this privatization model. In Los Angeles, John Daisy was his protege. He was pushed onto the board by Broad, and then Broad, he hired people in that administration that Broad paid for. So basically you had high-ranking people within the LAUSD working for Broad, but running the school district. And under that we had such scandals as the iPads, where we spent $1.3 billion on an iPad program that was untested, possibly illegally financed. And we also had the Mises crisis, where we changed the student data information, and it was a program that was untested, but they put it into the schools anyway, and resulted in collapse of the system, basically. Children's schedules were wrong, and basically everything was tied into this data system, and people had to sue the district. It was supposed to cost about $30 million, I think, and it ended up costing $200 million to fully implement, and it's not fixed yet. They say it's fixed, but it's still not working.
Now, to back up a little bit about education privatization, Diane Ravitch, who is the guru of our movement, she fights education privatization, used to be the Undersecretary of Education under George H.W. Bush. And at that point, she was a Republican. She was very much in favor of charters. She was very much in favor of standardized testing. And in the interim years, she's done a complete 180. She now understands that the schools are not doing poor. The students in low-income schools are not doing poorly because of public education or because of teachers. They're doing poorly because of poverty and the lack of prenatal care, the lack of preschool, not going to school with a full breakfast, not being read to at night, a whole host of issues that need to be dealt with. And yet the privatization movement has made it about public schools and public teachers. Can you talk a little bit about the propaganda that they have disseminated?
It's funny because even people who are on our side will ask me, well, what are we going to do about failing schools? But they're created to fail almost. We look at standardized tests that are supposed to measure it, and they're not really standardized because they don't exclude all these other data that are going into it and what's affecting these children. And if we don't look at the other situations in their lives, we can't just expect them to go to school and automatically learn. So we've created this myth of all the schools are failing and all the teachers are failing, and therefore we have to get rid of tenure, and they've built it into a marketing program. So now they've convinced a lot of parents that the only way your children are going to get a decent education is to send them to a charter school. So we need to attack that also in how parents look at the schools. I was very involved last year in El Camino Real, and it was a case where the principal charged over $100,000 on the school credit card on things like steak dinners and first-class airfare. And there were actually parents who were attacking me for exposing this because they were saying, but we're such a great school. This school was actually, it was a public school before it was charter. They converted it to a charter. So it was always a great school. It's in a great area. But these people are convinced that because it has a charter in its name, it was better. So.
Now, the meta-analysis do show that charter schools do not outperform public schools. I was at the NAACP hearing last week, and Julian Vasquez-Heilig, who's a professor at Sacramento State, has written a lot about this, and he said in the last study it was 0.008%, which is negligible. And this is with the creaming or the cherry picking. Can you tell the audience about how they cherry pick students at charter schools, which is what they're not allowed to do at public schools?
Yeah, if you look at the data, they have percentage of special education children that are served is much lower. And then if you drill down further, what they count as special education isn't really the most difficult cases. So they will actually look for kids who have maybe attention deficit disorders, and they'll say, well, you should get this program. So they'll give them a 504, which is just basically they're making accommodations for them. So they're not doing much, but they're able to say, look, we help them in special education. Whereas if you go to severe special education, that's where the public schools are serving kids, because the public schools serve all children. That's how it should be. English learners, same thing, lower percentage in charters than the public schools. And behavioral problems. If a kid has a behavioral problem, they kick him out. Our neighborhood school was another one of those schools that was taken over by a charter. It was formerly a public school. My wife graduated high school at this school, and they took it over. And so my son went there, and they're a very good school if you're a high-achieving student. They have this unbelievably large number of gifted students, to which you have to ask, what's in the water if you're supposed to be serving the neighborhood kids? But my son wasn't one of those students that was, academically on it. I was a bad student too, and he was very much like me. And so it was one day, it was a rainy day, and he was walking between class, and he put his hood on, because that's what you do when it's raining. Well, the dress code for the school was you had to wear the school's hat if you were going to wear a hat. So they, pulled him over. The dean, went to write him up, and my son protested, which I was proud of him for. But the first words out of their mouth were, this is a charter, we can get rid of you.
They say, but these are public schools. They're public schools because they get public funding, but they're privately run.
Right, so, and in most cases, they're run by a board that is not elected. So when our neighborhood school first went charter, it was presented to the parents and the teachers as a way for them to get more control, which I think is great. As a board member, that's what I want. I want the local schools to have more control. We have too much of a bureaucracy. But now, by the time they renewed their first charter, parents no longer had a right to elect people to the board. On the last charter, they made some more changes, but since the charter was renewed, they just took out the right for teachers to elect members. They somehow said, well, that's illegal, which is crazy. And I filed complaints with the school district and said they're running a governing board that is not what's described in the charter. Nothing's been done.
And why the business people that are trying to privatize education like this is because they can sell things in. This is why Microsoft, why Bill Gates, why Apple, why Pearson, the largest textbook publisher, why they are so heavily invested in charter schools, because what they want to do is they want to use everything, put everything on iPads or everything on a computer. They want to do everything with the software program, have all the curricula on software, and they want to reduce teachers to classroom managers, minimum wage employees who just sit at the front and keep order while students are learning with their devices. And this is what's so insidious. And in a charter school, where the boards, like you said, aren't even educators, they're business people, it's easier for them to sell this stuff into charter schools. The other thing that people don't know, and as a matter of fact, the people on the NAACP hearing didn't know this when I mentioned it, is something called the New Market Tax Credit. That if you are invest in a charter school in a low-income community and it's still standing after 7 years, you get a 37% tax credit, which is why all the hedge fund billionaires are funding them. What they're doing is they're trying to make it look like a civil rights thing. My son was at Westwood Charter, which was a publicly run and publicly funded charter school. LAUSD oversaw it. The teachers were unionized. They were members of UTLA, but they were able, the teachers and the administrators at that school, to somewhat design their own curriculum. So it was a great school, but he has special needs, my son, ADHD, and when he was going on to the next level, he could not be in a class with 45 kids. And fortunately, I was privileged to have the resources to send him to private school. It's a private school that was very integrated, and the headmaster was very liberal, and I would talk to the headmaster about this all the time, about my feeling about charters, and he would say, Lauren, you can afford to send your kid to a charter school, to a private school. How can you tell a poor black mother in South LA that she doesn't have the choice? That's the Orwellian term they use, school choice. That she doesn't have the choice to send her kid to a charter where there's 24 kids in a classroom and a laptop on every desk. And I said, Peter, you're asking the wrong question. It should be, why doesn't every public school have 24 kids in a classroom and a laptop on every desk? That's the answer. So that leads us into, what would you do if you got onto the school board?
The first thing we have to do is start holding these charters accountable. Because right now there is no accountability. The Charter School Division and the LAUSD is run by a former staffer of the California Charter School Association. They refer to charters as partners. The law stated that design charters, they're supposed to be competition. Schools were supposed to improve through competition. But if you look at these charters and you say there are partners, where's the competition? So what's happening, and it's great to say everybody's going to get choice, but the only choice that is showing any marketing improvement is the magnets. So that's where, if Eli Broad really wants to help schools, forget about doing charters. Why doesn't he put his money to letting the district create more magnets? I suggest he likes his name on a lot of things, so perhaps we can call it the Eli Broad Magnet Program, and then he would put some money towards it. But so if we don't start holding them accountable, they are going to drive the district bankrupt. Because right now, with the cherry picking that they're doing, the district is not only losing students and therefore revenue, but the students that are left have bigger needs than the charters are serving. So therefore, it's more expensive per student to educate. So if you keep that in balance, eventually bankruptcy is going to occur.
Now, tell us about your opponent, Monica Garcia. She's been on the school board. How long has she been on the school board? What bad things has she done? And tell us who's financing her and how much money she's gotten from those interests.
So she's been the board member for 10 years. Before that, she was the chief of staff of the previous board member. So she's been there 12 years. It's funny, we had our debate, and she was last week, and she kept on saying, we need change, and I'm the person to bring change. And I looked at her at the end and said, at what point does the change become the status quo? You've been there 10 years. There's no chance for change anymore. You're the one who people are going after if you want to change things. So, and she's being financed by the charter school industry, and the people who provide money. When I looked at her donors, it's really depressing because the first one was J.J. Abrams, and I'm like, but I like Star Wars. And, so it's, all the ones that you would suspect, the Waltons are on there, and John Daisy, he did the maximum too. A couple of weeks ago, the Celerity schools, which are a group of charter schools, they got raided by the FBI. The head of that school and a couple more people that run that school, they donated the max. So it's just charter money and people trying to prevent charters from being held accountable. Because when she sits there and approves bad charters, they benefit. So just last month, they approved the View Park Middle School. The California Charter School Association itself ranked this school a 1 out of 10. But yet we still approved it. They got caught. They were accepting special education students, but as of October, they hadn't provided any services. They hadn't even hired a resource teacher. And, you have to feel for the parents. They're probably being promised the whole time the teacher's coming. Don't worry, it's going to happen. But somebody has to be watching to make sure that they're accountable. And in the end, we're all paying for this. It's our tax money. So, I think she's just so beholden to them that even a failing school like that passes. And she voted for it.
I remember the bond issuances that they did to build more schools with the anticipation of increasing enrollment. And, of course, now the schools, apparently 100,000 kids have left the schools probably to go to charters. And that leaves room for the co-location issue, which is how I got involved in this with some people in this room. We were fighting co-location of a charter school in Venice High School. Basically, Prop 39 says that if you have any empty classrooms, and they will count a broom closet or a classroom where a teacher is grading a paper after class as an empty classroom, then you have to allow a charter to come in there. They also have something called parent revolution, the parent trigger law, which was a state law, and that also leads to privatization. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that?
So Prop 39, it's another case. Well, first of all, it was foisted upon the voters kind of underhandedly. It was part of a proposition that was supposed to reduce the number of voters that needed to approve a bond measure. That's what it was billed at. And this language for the co-locations, and actually co-location is not listed in the law. They're just supposed to be provided space. But the district is afraid to fight back. In some cases, they haven't provided it and they've been sued. So now they're very gun-shy on it. And the law is very specific that the district does not have to spend its general fund money to create more classrooms. So in some cases, they're creating space where it's not there because they're afraid of being sued. And there's the 2nd Street Elementary School. So I go to all the schools before in the morning. to meet parents and pass out flyers. And you have a gate, and all the students in the school go through that gate. But the charter schools go to the left, and the public schools go to the right. And the ones going to the charter school, they all have uniforms provided. They sit down, they have their breakfast before school, when breakfast should be served, and all these different things. And the other kids are, just kind of free play. And it's this us versus them in the same building. And schools should be, communities. That's not a community.
Yeah, we call it separate but unequal. And that's exactly what was the situation before Brown versus Board of Education, the desegregation Supreme Court case in 1954. And what's happened is that schools are now more segregated than before Brown versus Board of Education. And charter schools have played a role. John Rogers at UCLA has done the research on this. And that's why the NAACP, to their credit, has called for a moratorium on more charter schools.
We spoke before about the failing school myth. She sat there on the board and just said most of our kids can't read. And I'm like, wait, you're running for a re-election. You think the kids can't read? Perhaps you should step aside.
So I want to just be able to say where people who are watching this can donate to you, because basically, Bernie Sanders has called for people to run for office. He's called for people to support those who are running for office. And a $27 donation would be fantastic. That's the Bernie donation, or whatever you can afford, because Carl has no money, seriously. So if we can help him by sharing this video and making a contribution, before the election on March 7th, that would be really great, because at this point, the goal is to try to make sure that she does not get 51% of the vote. If she gets 51% of the vote, there is no runoff. So now I want to open it up to questions from the audience.
My question to you about co-location, which, like you said, was snuck in to everyone's surprise. Has anyone tried to make the case that the co-location never goes both ways? A neighborhood school that doesn't have a gym, or this, that, or the other research, and this celebrity-sponsored fancy schmancy charter 2 blocks away, they could claim your broom closet, but you can't get into their running track.
Genius.
It's the same thing with the parent trigger. They are able to convert a public school to a charter, but I don't think the mechanism is to go the other way. What happens when the parents are tired of the charter? Because let's face it, if you shut down a charter, or a charter has to shut down, it's the children who suffer. The parents have to scramble for a new school, or, that's why we end up in, with our kids in the neighborhood charter. Because, my daughter wants to go to school with her friends that she went to at middle school, and, I'm not going to take that away from her.
The parent trigger thing, because it wasn't explained, is another law that says that if 51% of the parents sign a document, you can take the school charter, fire the principal, or close the school. So Parent Revolution, they hire young Latino organizers to go and create dissent among parents, to tell them, oh, your kid isn't doing very well, it's because of the teacher, or it's because of the principal, and they get them to sign this document, and then they try to take the school over. Instead of always being on the defensive with stopping the onslaught of charter schools, what can we propose from within the school board that will make people see that they're not necessary?
Yeah, so it's funny. The big push from some of the board members now is we need to market more. I'm thinking, instead of marketing more, why don't you look at how they're marketing? So I was riding the subway, and I had the KIPP schools, and we have music classes, we have after school, we have this, we have that. Why don't we have that? Why don't we start looking at that? And the other thing I think is the bureaucracy is just so big, and they need to start kicking some of the power from that bureaucracy to the schools, so the schools could look at their local populations and say, this is what our populations want, and this is how we want to fix it. I think if you started doing that and started actually listening to parents and, actually engaging with parents, parents would see that these were schools that I want to send my kid to. The way I see it, I want to put the charters out of business by making the public schools better. Let's make the public schools the choice. And I think we need to look at the board members. If you have so many charters in your board district, you've done something wrong. You failed. and start looking at it that way.
In thinking about what's going on with Eli Broad, and he didn't even choose his own collection. He had people choosing his collection for investment purposes. I don't consider him a professional art collector. I consider him a person who purchases art for stock purchasing only. So what I'm getting to is when the charters come around and they're in these all through the district, what is it doing to the communities? Because the way I see it is it's splitting up the people who live in the community on that block. And now those children are all separated. They're spoked out to different places. It's a way to actually break down the community, break down the parent engagement, because now the parents are going in all different directions as well. And when you lose that sense of community, you lose that parent engagement, and then it creates an opportunity for land grabs when you're putting those charters out there. And Eli is a real estate dude.
It's interesting. We have the Baudry building, which is the headquarters to the district, and I recently found out that Eli Broad's company actually used to own that building and had trouble selling it, and then miraculously it was bought by the district. It's a building where they said the floors are slanted, and there's all these structural defects, but he managed to offload it. And, he doesn't profit from. He says he doesn't profit for all the stuff he does with education. Seems like he profited there. So yeah, and I agree totally with you. When I was a kid, our schools were kind of like the centers of the neighborhood. My elementary school, I went to Boy Scout meetings there, and the Little League games were on the fields, and we went and played there after school. And now the schools are locked up, as schools, as soon as school ends, and there's, I want to see it. So it is the center of the neighborhood. I think we need partnerships with the city so that, we can keep the schoolyards open, maybe work with the Parks Department. Maybe when we're building libraries, instead of building separate libraries outside the schools, and when our school libraries are hurting and we don't have librarians in a lot of cases, why doesn't the city partner up with us and have a thing that can be used jointly? So yeah, I agree. And then you have the charters come in, and it's, whether it be the Prop 39 charters where they're physically separating schools, or you have schools, all the kids from the neighborhood going to different schools. And that kind of takes away from the whole neighborhood kids playing. And then they have, one of my daughters, because she's on the autism spectrum. It's funny because we have triplets, and each goes to a different type of school. One is at a charter that was taken over our neighborhood school. Because the other one is on the autism spectrum, and that school, of course, doesn't handle it. She goes to another public school. And then the third daughter, who's a little more severe, goes to a specialized school. So it's a non-public, but it's paid for by the district. So it's 3 different types of schools. And she has to get on a bus like an hour and a half before school. She spends forever on that bus. So if kids are being bused all over the place, and the local school is, where's the after-school play is also, you kind of lose the whole neighborhood.
Last year, the legislature passed 2 bills to regulate charter schools, and they both failed. Can you speak to that? Sure. If you know anything more about it.
Yeah, they actually passed the legislature. They got to Governor Brown's desk, and the governor vetoed it. Perhaps something to do with the fact that he's opened up his own charter schools. And yeah, and this is, I just re-registered as a Green, and that's one of the reasons, because if we're going to fight the Republicans in Washington, and of course the issue I watch is education, how could we fight them if the people who are supposed to be fighting them, we have to fight them first? The LA County Young Democrats, this was the final straw for me, they have endorsed all the charter candidates.
Now, if they didn't have money and they wanted to volunteer for you, how would they go about doing that?
You can contact me also through the website, or you can email me at changethelAUSD@gmail.com. And every weekend I'm out there, so we can coordinate and knock on doors.